August 1945, the air over Kyushu shimmered with heat and smoke. In the courtyard of an army communications post, Japanese officers crouched over a map table, ink-stained, worn, trembling beneath the weight of what it now meant. The war lines that once reached across the Pacific were nothing but lies on paper. Someone heard it first, a low hum rolling in from the east. Then came the glints, small, bright, metallic, like needles of light weaving through the clouds. The P-51s, dozens of them, sleek, silver, fast. The Cadillac of the sky. Engines roared above the mountains. Leaves rippled. The youngest officer dropped his brush. The major in charge gave no order to resist. He only said quietly, "Burn them." Flames took the edges of the maps first, curling through islands, swallowing coasts, erasing the empire 1 inch at a time. Smoke rose into the hot air, black against the silver wings overhead. For years Japan had conquered by map, line by line, ocean by ocean. Now those same maps turned to ash under the thunder of American Mustangs. And from that smoke began the end of the Pacific War. In the early 1940s, Japan's empire stretched wider than at any point in its history. From the icy Aleutians to the coral atolls of the South Pacific, its red rising sun flags dotted the map like a spreading tide. The Imperial Japanese Army had swept through Manchuria, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Its navy ruled the Western Pacific, its air forces dominated skies once thought unreachable by Asian aircraft. To the Japanese command, the empire's reach seemed divine, an extension of the emperor's will and destiny. But by 1943, the tide had begun to shift. The United States, wounded but not broken after Pearl Harbor, had transformed itself into a war machine of unprecedented scale. Thousands of aircraft rolled off American production lines each month. Fleets of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers leapt across the Pacific in what would come to be called the island hopping campaign, each captured island serving as a new springboard toward the Japanese homeland. While Japanese propaganda spoke of eternal victory, its pilots and sailors began to feel the opposite. At Guadalcanal, Midway, and the Marianas, Japan lost not only men and machines, but something less tangible: initiative. Each defeat shrank the empire's circle of defense. Each new island lost meant American bombers could strike deeper. The Pacific became a chessboard of attrition. Japan's once proud Zero fighters, agile but fragile, faced an enemy that adapted faster than it could. New American planes, heavier, faster, armored, were not just machines. They were symbols of industrial might. Japan's factories, starved of steel and fuel, could not compete. Its pilots, once the elite of the skies, were replaced by barely trained cadets flying outdated aircraft. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters continued to issue maps that showed the IWWII Empire in bold red. But those lines were illusions. On the ground and in the air, the war was collapsing. By 1944, the Americans had captured Saipan and Guam, turning points that placed Japan within range of B-29 superfortresses. The strategic bombing of the Japanese mainland began soon after. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya burned under waves of incendiary raids that turned entire districts into oceans of flame. Yet even with cities burning, Japan's military clung to its code: honor before surrender, duty before survival. Commanders drew new maps daily, lines of defense that existed only on paper. For every one captured island, another was promised to be held to the death. And still the sky kept closing in. The American advance was not merely geographical, it was psychological. Each island taken became an airfield, each airfield a stage for the next wave. The Japanese garrisons left behind were cut off, forgotten, and told to die in place. They fought with no hope of relief, only to delay the inevitable. The U.S. Army Air Forces and Navy understood that total victory in the Pacific would require not only ground conquest, but also the domination of the air. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, first the P-38 Lightning, then the P-47 Thunderbolt, was a step forward, but the distances remained immense. Japan's heartland was still hundreds of miles from the nearest American base. Then came the Mustang. Originally designed as a British fighter, the North American P-51 was transformed when fitted with the rolls-royce Merlin engine. It could fly higher, faster, and most crucially, farther than any fighter before it. Its range of nearly 5,600 kilometers meant it could now accompany B-29 bombers all the way to Japan and back. But for that, the Americans needed one more island, one close enough to Japan to act as the final launch pad. That island was Iwo Jima. In early 1945, while Japanese commanders prepared to defend it with 21,000 men dug deep into volcanic tunnels, American engineers were already studying how to turn its airstrips into the last stepping stone before Tokyo. The invasion would cost more than 26,000 American casualties, but when the Black Sands fell silent, the path to the Japanese mainland and air supremacy was open. The sky would never belong to Japan again. By the spring of 1945, the empire that had once seemed unstoppable was breathing through the cracks of its own ruin. Japan's military maps were filled with red circles, each one marking an airfield destroyed, a convoy lost, a base cut off. Beneath the facade of duty and pride, the officers knew the truth. The Empire was cornered. The loss of Iwo Jima was more than a defeat. It was a sentence. The island's 3 airfields became forward bases for the U.S. 20th Air Force. From there, the Silver Giants, B-29 super fortresses, could launch daily raids on Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. No city was beyond reach now, and overhead, the roar that once terrified American sailors at Pearl Harbor was replaced by a new sound. The steady, confident growl of American air power filling the Pacific sky. Japan's own air defense was collapsing. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and the Imperial Navy Air Service, once proud rivals, now shared the same desperation. Their best pilots had been lost over Midway and the Marianas. Replacements were teenagers, barely trained, flying aircraft built from wood and scrap aluminum. Fuel was rationed, engines failed in midair, and spare parts existed only on paper. Tokyo's factories still produced planes, but not pilots. Schools were emptied to find more cadets. Training hours were cut from hundreds to dozens. The result was predictable. Entire squadrons of green pilots sent into the teeth of American formations that outnumbered and outperformed them 10-1. The P-51 Mustang arrived at this moment, a weapon designed for a war already won, but one that made the end inevitable. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and laminar flow wings, the Mustang could cruise faster than a Zero could dive. It flew higher, struck farther, and carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns that shredded enemy aircraft before they even closed in. From Iwo Jima's volcanic runways, Mustangs now escorted the B-29s all the way to the Japanese homeland and back. The difference was not just mechanical. It was moral. The Japanese had once held the advantage of proximity and preparation. Now, for the first time, American pilots could choose the time and place of every encounter. The defenders could only react. When the first formations of P-51s appeared over the mainland, the effect was devastating. The planes were sleek, reflective, almost alien. Sunlight flashing off their polished fuselages as they passed above cities still smoldering from earlier raids. Civilians called them silver ghosts. Soldiers called them messengers of the end. Japanese intelligence officers tried to map their flight paths, to predict their patterns, but it was futile. The Mustangs came in low one day, high the next, sometimes alone, sometimes in packs. They strafed railways, airfields, and communication lines. One by one, the tools of command vanished. Radios went silent, fuel depots exploded, maps lost meaning. Inside command bunkers from Kyushu to Okinawa, officers watched red markers creep closer on their charts. American squadrons moving freely across what had once been their empire. Those same officers who once plotted invasions of China and the Philippines were now ordered to destroy their own records. Maps were burned not only to prevent capture, but to erase shame, to wipe away the evidence of how far they had fallen. It was an act repeated in dozens of bases across the islands. Maps, code books, and orders thrown into oil drums or burned on stone floors, while the rumble of P-51s shook the roofs overhead. Some did it under command, others did it quietly, without orders, as a final gesture of control in a war they could no longer command. To the Americans above, it was another successful sweep. To those below, it was the sound of the empire disintegrating in real time. When Japanese officers burned their maps, they weren't just destroying paper. They were destroying the illusion that the empire still had a direction. The war that began with precise coordinates and bold red arrows now ended with smoke rising from ashes of cartography, swallowed by the roar of the Mustangs. The next chapter would not be drawn on maps, but written in fire and surrender. By 1945, the Japanese airmen who climbed into their cockpits did so knowing the sky no longer belonged to them. For the young pilots stationed on the home islands, death was not a possibility. It was a schedule. Their instructors, once veterans of China or Pearl Harbor, now taught survival for minutes, not missions. Most cadets had never seen combat before being ordered to intercept American bombers at impossible odds. When the silver P-51s appeared, even experienced pilots felt the difference. The Mustang was faster in a climb, steadier in a dive, and cruelly patient in pursuit. Reports describe encounters that lasted mere seconds, a flash, a burst of tracers, and a column of smoke spiraling toward the sea. The Japanese command tried to cloak these losses in rhetoric. "To die for the emperor is to live forever," read the bulletins. But morale was no longer built on conviction. It was held together by fear and fatalism. In the final months, thousands of young men were assigned to special attack units, the Kamikaze Corps, not because of faith in victory, but because there were no planes or fuel left for sustained combat. For the Americans, the experience was different, but no less human. P-51 pilots flying out of Iwo Jima endured 7-hour missions over open water, often alone. Many spoke later of a strange duality, the pride of mastery, the guilt of destruction. They could see the flames of Tokyo from the air, entire neighborhoods vanishing beneath them, and knew they were witnessing something beyond tactics, the erasure of a civilization's war dream. One Mustang pilot later wrote, "It was beautiful from above. The fires were like constellations, and that's what haunted me most." The human side of air supremacy was not triumph. It was transformation. Those who flew learned that power had a cost, and those below learned that courage could not outfly technology. Angle 2. The Technological Revolution, the machine that ended the empire. The P-51 Mustang was not just another aircraft. It was the culmination of engineering lessons paid for in blood. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Allies had no fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. By the time the Mustang entered full service in late 1943, it had solved that problem. Its secret was balance. The British-designed Merlin engine gave it altitude power, while the American airframe gave it endurance. It could fly at 440 miles per hour, reach altitudes above 40,000 feet, and stay airborne long enough to cross oceans. This combination changed strategy itself. The B-29s could now raid the Japanese mainland by day with protection all the way home, a feat previously impossible. The Mustang turned strategic bombing from a gamble into a guarantee. For Japanese engineers, the shock was immense. Their Mitsubishi A6M0, once considered untouchable, had been designed for an earlier war. Lightweight, maneuverable, but vulnerable. It lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and the speed to compete. By 1945, even Japan's advanced prototypes, like the Ki-84 Hayate or the Shidenkai, arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The technological gap was not merely mechanical, it represented the industrial gap of two worlds. America could mass-produce precision, while Japan, cut off from resources, could only improvise. Aluminum was replaced with bamboo, engines with half their rated power were sent to the front, and maintenance crews resorted to cannibalizing parts from wrecked planes. Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots returned from each mission with reams of aerial photographs, mapping destruction and movement in real time. Japanese command posts, still relying on paper charts and radio intercepts, were blind to their own battlefield. It was this difference between the analog empire and the mechanized democracy that decided the war long before the surrender papers were signed. Every empire fights its final battles in the mind before it does on the ground. For Japan, that mental collapse was charted on its own maps. Throughout 1944 and 1945, maps produced by the Imperial General Staff still showed defensive perimeters stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific. Some islands were already under American control, yet still marked as strongholds. Others had no garrisons left, but were labeled active defense zones. It was cartography as denial. Officers used these maps in briefings that no one believed anymore. The lines existed to give the illusion of purpose, to tell pilots and soldiers that their sacrifice connected to a plan. But when the Mustangs began striking deep into the mainland, those lines turned meaningless. Communications broke down faster than updates could arrive. Units vanished without reports. Entire islands ceased responding. And in the face of daily air raids, the concept of a front line dissolved completely. Japan was no longer defending an empire. It was defending itself from the sky. American strategy, by contrast, was brutally clear. Seize islands close enough for fighter bases. Build, refuel, bomb, and move forward. No wasted motion, no moral hesitation. By the summer of 1945, this clarity left Japanese officers facing an impossible truth. They were commanders without a battlefield. When the P-51s appeared above their cities, there was nothing left to maneuver, no coordinates left to shift. The maps that once symbolized control now symbolized futility. Burning them was not madness, it was acknowledgement. The empire's geography had collapsed, but its leadership could not yet say the word defeat. The deeper Japan sank into defeat, the more its leaders clung to Bushido, the centuries-old warrior code that prized loyalty and death over surrender. For pilots and officers, the moral framework that had once given meaning to conquest now became a trap. In earlier years, Bushido had inspired ferocity. By 1945, it demanded self-destruction. Commanders still lectured recruits on the glory of sacrifice, but the reality outside the barracks contradicted every ideal. Cities lay in ruins, families starved, and every dawn brought the drone of approaching bombers. To live was to disobey the myth. When the P-51 swept across the mainland, that moral dissonance reached its breaking point. Some officers still shouted orders to resist, others quietly packed their insignia into drawers, unwilling to order more men to die for maps that no longer described the world. The act of burning those maps was, in itself, a moral rebellion. It broke the code without defying it openly, a silent admission that honor now meant sparing lives rather than losing them. To burn a map was to choose truth over ritual, survival over illusion. Even among the common soldiers, the tone changed. Letters from the front stopped invoking victory and began asking forgiveness. Pilots wrote to their mothers instead of their emperors. One fragment found after the war read simply, "The sky is theirs now. Tell father I tried." In that shift lay the quiet end of an empire, not the surrender in Tokyo Bay, but the moment when men stopped believing that dying for the empire meant anything at all. For the American pilots flying the P-51s, Japan was a landscape glimpsed mostly through gun sights and smoke. They called the missions the longest raids of the war. From Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back was nearly 1,500 miles, 7 hours of flight, often through storms, flak, and fatigue. Each squadron launched before dawn. The sun would rise behind them as they climbed past 20,000 feet, the ocean below turning silver in the light. Ahead lay the dark mass of Japan, and within it, hundreds of targets marked only as coordinates. They were told that Japan's air force was finished, but the sky still held danger. Occasionally, Zeros or Ki-84s would claw upward, their pilots desperate and unafraid of death. The Americans respected them, even pitied them. One pilot later recalled, "They came at us head-on, like ghosts who didn't know they were already dead." From above, the Americans saw a nation unraveling. Rail lines cut, ships adrift, towns burning. Many wrote that it was beautiful, terrible, and strangely quiet, the most haunting. Missions were those without opposition. No flak, no fighters, only the empty sky. By late 1945, the P-51 squadrons were flying almost unchallenged. Their dominance was total, but their emotions were complicated. They were trained to win, not to witness the extinction of an enemy's will. When the Japanese began destroying their own bases and burning their maps, the pilots didn't understand the symbolism. Only later did intelligence reports reveal it. To them, it was a strange sight. Fires blooming on runways that no longer launched planes, officers waving white cloth from bunkers instead of signals to attack. The Mustang circled above, engines idling, as if watching a civilization close its own doors. Victory from the air felt both absolute and hollow. As one pilot wrote in his logbook after Japan's final mission, "The last enemy I saw was smoke." Angle 6. The Leadership's Final Act. To Command in the Void. Inside Japan's command centers, defeat unfolded in paperwork. Reports arrived hours late, if at all. Radio networks failed, officers argued, and the silence from the front grew heavier each day. For every confirmed air raid, 10 rumors spread. Of invasions, of uprisings, of fleets that no longer existed. Senior officers knew the truth long before the Emperor's announcement. The maps they studied were no longer tools of war, but relics of a vanished order. On them were drawn territories now controlled by the enemy, fleets that had been sunk months earlier, and airfields reduced to ash. To issue commands from such maps was absurd, yet to acknowledge that absurdity was treason. And so orders continued. Phantom divisions redirected, ghost fleets reassigned, defensive lines planned over ruins. When the first waves of P-51s began escorting bombers over Tokyo, the absurdity could no longer be ignored. The Army's central communications grid collapsed. The Navy's air command could no longer trace its squadrons. One general on Kyushu gave the quiet order to burn all maps and records, not from panic, but from understanding. The information they held no longer protected Japan. It endangered those who carried it. In the final weeks, some officers chose ritual suicide. Others surrendered quietly to local authorities. A few, like General Ushijima on Okinawa, fought to the last bullet. But the majority, stripped of purpose, simply faded into silence. Leadership in those days was not about command, it was about collapse, managed with dignity. The act of burning maps became symbolic of that final acceptance. It was the gesture of men who understood that their command no longer extended beyond the walls around them. By the time Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed through the radio on August 15th, the Empire's real surrender had already taken place, in bunkers lit by candlelight where maps turned to ash and generals watched their world dissolve into smoke. March 1945. The sky above Tokyo glowed before dawn. To those on the ground, it was a new sun. Silent at first, then roaring as it grew. B-29s filled the heavens in perfect formation, their contrails stretching across the horizon like white scars. Beneath them, sleek silver escorts cut through the morning haze. P-51 Mustangs, flying in disciplined arcs around the bombers they guarded. From the command bunkers below, Japanese officers watched through binoculars as their city began to burn. The air raid sirens barely rose above the thunder of engines. On that single night, 100,000 civilians would die, and a quarter of Tokyo would vanish beneath the fires. But to the officers in uniform, another realization settled deeper than grief. They no longer controlled the sky. The first waves of P-51s had flown from Iwo Jima just weeks earlier, a mission once thought impossible. Now hundreds made the journey daily. They arrived over Japan with fuel enough to fight, escort, and return. The Empire's isolation was complete. Every port, airfield, and road could be reached. Nowhere was beyond the reach of American steel. At Atsugi, at Kagoshima, at small field posts near Mount Fuji, officers scrambled to organize defenses that no longer existed. They stared at telephones that rang without answer, radios that hissed with static. The old maps, proud charts of the co-prosperity sphere, now looked absurd beneath the glow of kerosene lamps. Islands that once carried legions were marked in red, but they no longer belonged to Japan. A young lieutenant at one of the air command posts recalled the moment in his diary. The ground shook not from bombs, but from the air itself. We were told the Mustangs were few. Today they filled the sky. We could see them, shining, so cool that and we knew what that meant. The end had wings. By noon, the first Mustang strafing runs began. They came in low, targeting railway junctions and airfields. The sound of 50 caliber gunfire ripped through hangars and fuel depots, shredding the last remnants of Japan's air strength. In some bases, the pilots never made it off the ground. In others, aircraft burned before their engines could turn. The surviving commanders gathered around their maps, the same ones used for months to coordinate phantom squadrons. The airfields they pointed to no longer existed. The runways marked in black ink were smoldering craters. The routes they plotted were suicide. Then the order came from the regional command: destroy all documents, burn maps, records, and coordinates. At first, some resisted. Maps were the symbols of their identity, their rank. They had built empires with these papers. To burn them felt like treason. But outside, the sky rumbled again. Another formation of Mustangs circling, dropping lower with every pass. The officers understood. One by one, they carried the charts outside. Some placed them in metal drums, doused them with fuel, and struck matches. Others simply held the edges to lanterns, watching the flames curl through paper that had once defined nations. Ink turned to ash. The Pacific disappeared. The red zones of control, the proud lines of conquest, burned like dry leaves. Above, the Mustangs kept circling, engines humming. Whether by coincidence or calculation, their shadows passed directly over the burning compounds. To the men below, it seemed as if the sky itself was watching the maps die. For the Americans, it was another routine sortie, strafing supply routes, suppressing defenses. But intelligence officers later noted strange fires near Japanese bases, fires that didn't spread, that burned in perfect circles. It would take months after the surrender to understand what those fires meant. On that day, the Japanese army ceased to be a mapped force. No more coordinates, no more charts of advance or retreat, just islands, cities, and ruins. The officers stood before the flames not as conquerors or defenders, but as witnesses to their own unmaking. The Mustang pilots, oblivious to what happened below, climbed higher, refueling on the wind. The air war was nearly over, but in that moment, when paper burned and silver wings glinted above the smoke, the symbolic end of the Pacific War was already written. The Empire had drawn its last line. The fire erased it. The following weeks after the first Mustang raids marked the death of Japan's air command, not in one decisive battle, but in a slow, suffocating unraveling. Every morning began with the same ritual: static over the radio, the faint whine of engines in the distance, and then the deep rumble of destruction rolling inward from the coast. Reports came in fragments. Base 47, no response. Okinawa, lost contact. Fuel depot, destroyed. The Empire's communication network, once the nervous system of conquest, was collapsing in real time. Even the most loyal officers could no longer pretend that maps meant control. The terrain itself had turned hostile. Mountains echoing with bombs, rivers running black with oil, skies so crowded with enemy planes that daylight felt foreign. At Yawata, Japan's last functional steel plant burned for 3 days. The Mustang escort strafed anything that moved: locomotives, supply trucks, even boats drifting along the rivers. By the time the raids reached Nagoya, factories stood like skeletons, and entire neighborhoods had vanished under firebombs. What little aviation fuel remained was hidden in caves, rationed for suicide intercept missions that never took off. In the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, the silence was heavier than any explosion. Meetings were still held, schedules still printed, orders still stamped, but everyone knew the performance had lost its audience. When a colonel arrived one morning to find his maps replaced by blank sheets, he didn't question it. The message was clear. There was nothing left to command. The few surviving Japanese pilots who did make it into the air described the final battles not as combat but as endurance. They flew through clouds of smoke so dense they could no longer see the horizon. Their instruments failed, their engines coughed and sputtered from bad fuel, and when they did find the enemy, it was like looking into the future. Sleek Mustangs flashing past at impossible speed, guns flaring with mechanical precision. Some Japanese pilots deliberately dove into the sea rather than face the humiliation of being hunted. Others crash-landed in fields, bowed toward Tokyo, and broke their swords. The code of Bushido had no answer for the machine age. The Mustang squadrons kept coming. Their silver silhouettes filled the afternoon skies, marking the beginning of a new kind of war, one where machines replaced empires and airfields replaced borders. In June, Tokyo's military command issued a final directive to its regional stations. Preserve what you can. Destroy what you must. Do not let the enemy find your routes. It was the closest thing to an admission of defeat yet made. The same officers who once drew their empire's reach across oceans now stood over ash pits, watching their own coordinates burn. On one small airbase in Kyushu, a field commander recorded what happened next in his logbook. At dusk, I ordered the remaining charts burned. We listened to the wind and the roar of the P-51s returning west. The firelight flickered on our faces. For the first time, I felt no fear, only relief. The maps are gone. The burden of command has lifted. That night, there were no air raids, no alarms. The Mustangs did not return. For the first time in years, the officers stepped outside without helmets, without shouting orders. The stars were visible again. Across Japan, the same quiet spread. The noise of the war, the mechanical thunder that had defined life for nearly a decade, fell away into something unrecognizable. Silence. In that silence, Japan's defeat became real. Not when the Emperor spoke, not when the Americans landed, but in those empty nights when there were no planes left to send and no maps left to follow. For the Americans, the raids continued out of habit more than necessity. The Mustang wings returned to Iwo Jima, to Tinian, to Saipan, bringing back aerial photographs of ruins where entire cities had stood. Intelligence officers flipped through the images, noting that Japanese bases no longer showed movement. Some wondered aloud whether anyone remained to fight. They were right to wonder. By August, Japan's air command was a formality, a chain of names and titles without soldiers, without machines, without meaning. The only movement left came from couriers carrying surrender drafts under white flags, traveling roads once mapped for conquest, and so it ended where it had begun, with fire. The same fire that consumed Pearl Harbor's ships now consumed Japan's maps, bases, and illusions. The same sky that once belonged to P-51 art. The rising sun was now ruled by polished steel and American insignia. When the final order came, cease all operations, await further instructions. No one moved. There was nothing left to cease and no one left to instruct. The flames had done what armies could not. They erased an empire. When the smoke finally thinned over Japan, what remained was not a battlefield, it was a void. Cities that had once defined an empire's pride had been reduced to outlines. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, they no longer resembled cities at all, only vast plains of rubble stretching to the horizon. Trains sat melted on their rails, bridges hung half-collapsed over blackened rivers. In the silence after the raids, the only sound was the wind moving through hollowed buildings and the shuffle of survivors searching for water among the ashes. Japan's air defense, once a formidable web of bases, radar posts, and interceptor squadrons, no longer existed. Out of nearly 12,000 operational aircraft at the height of the war, fewer than 2,000 remained, and most of those were grounded by lack of fuel or maintenance. The P-51s had done more than destroy planes. They had dismantled the very idea that the Empire could still resist. Every flight that left Iwo Jima in those final months deepened the wound, carving away what little remained of Japan's ability to move, communicate, or hope. For the Americans, the transformation was absolute. Air dominance had become total. What began as a desperate defensive war after Pearl Harbor had evolved into an unstoppable offensive machine. In the final summer of the conflict, the U.S. Army Air Forces owned the Pacific sky. Their aircraft patrolled from dawn to dusk without challenge, reducing Japan's industrial core to smoke and embers. The Mustang, once just an escort, now acted as the sharp edge of air supremacy, a precision tool of destruction that cut the heart out of an empire. On the ground, Japanese officers walked through the remains of their bases with hollow eyes. The rituals of command, the salutes, the clipped orders, the daily reports, all persisted in form but not in spirit. Some units still reported fuel shortages, enemy sightings, and weather conditions, though no aircraft had taken off for days. These routines were less military discipline than denial, the final rhythm of a war that no longer existed. The civilians bore the rest. In Tokyo alone, more than 1 million were left homeless. In Osaka, the heat from the fires had reached such intensity that glass fused into the streets. The elderly sat by ruins that had been homes, clutching iron teapots or fragments of photographs. Food rationing collapsed entirely. Rail networks lay in ruin. Entire communities lived off rainwater and burned rice, scraped from the bottoms of pots. Yet even in ruin, a strange kind of calm settled. The raids stopped not because mercy returned, but because there were no longer targets left to destroy. American. Reconnaissance photos from late July 1945 show city grids flattened so evenly that pilots mistook them for empty fields. For many Japanese officers, that silence was worse than defeat. It was absence, the removal of everything they had once believed defined them. The act of burning their maps had prepared them for this moment more than they realized. With no borders left to defend and no empire left to draw, they were forced to confront a truth few soldiers ever face. Their entire purpose had vanished. The Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima and Guam each evening with their fuselages streaked in soot and salt, their pilots quiet. Some celebrated their victories with whiskey, others stared at the ocean. They had achieved what no generation before them had done: air mastery over an entire nation. But the cost, though not theirs to pay in rubble, was visible in every photograph they brought back. Beneath the silver wings of the P-51s, a civilization's war had ended not with surrender, but with erasure. The men who once drew Japan's reach across the Pacific now lived among its ashes. The maps were gone. The sky, once theirs to command, had become the domain of their conquerors. And in that empty sky hung the question that would haunt both victor and defeated alike. What comes after dominance? When Emperor Hirohito's voice finally reached the people on August 15, 1945, it came through static and disbelief. For most of Japan, it was the first time they had ever heard his voice. Soft, formal, almost unreal. He did not use the word surrender. Instead, he spoke of enduring the unendurable. Yet everyone listening understood. The war, the empire, the world they had built and bled for, was over. Across the nation, men who had fought under the rising sun stood in stunned silence. Some wept. Some stared at the ground. Others, especially officers, removed their caps and placed them on the earth. For the first time in years, there were no orders left to follow. In the weeks that followed, the occupation began not with invasion, but with arrival. American transport planes touched down on airfields that had once been bombed to ruin. At Atsugi and Yokota, U.S. forces found the remnants of Japan's Air Corps waiting in neat formation, aircraft stripped of fuel, lined up like offerings. Their wings were covered in dust. Many bore scorch marks, the ghosts of fires where maps and documents had been destroyed. When the first squadrons of P-51s escorted the surrender flights into Tokyo, even the Americans felt a kind of reverence. They had come not as raiders, but as witnesses to the stillness they had created. The silver Mustangs, once symbols of destruction, now became escorts of peace, gleaming sentinels above a defeated empire. Japanese officers watched them pass overhead and recognized the cruel symmetry. The same aircraft that had burned their world now guarded their surrender. In that paradox lay a truth as deep as any. Battlefield lesson. Power is fleeting, but transformation endures. For the Americans, victory brought both pride and unease. The pilots of the 20th Air Force had flown more than 30,000 sorties over Japan. They had seen cities turned to cinders, rivers run red, mountains stripped bare. Their aircraft returned home without a single enemy fighter to challenge them, yet the absence of resistance brought no joy. One pilot wrote home, "We have no enemies left to fight, only ghosts." The devastation they left behind was beyond imagination. By war's end, 66 Japanese cities had been bombed. Nearly 3 million civilians were dead or missing. The air war had rewritten the rules of warfare itself, shifting the center of power from ground to sky, from human endurance to mechanical reach. In the ruins, surviving Japanese officers recorded their final reflections. Many described not anger but emptiness, a sense of standing at the edge of history, watching the old world dissolve. One commander from the Kyushu Air Defense wrote, "Our empire was measured in miles and maps. We forgot that power without mercy turns to dust." Others turned to rebuilding. Engineers who had once designed fighters began designing trains, tools, and radios. Pilots who survived became teachers, helping the next generation understand not the art of war, but the value of peace. The destruction of the empire became the foundation of a new Japan, one that would rise, not through conquest, but through creation. The P-51 Mustang II found a new identity. After the war, it was repainted, retooled, and exported to allies across the world. For years, it remained the symbol of dominance in the air. Yet to those who had faced it, it was remembered as something else entirely. In Japan, it was known simply as the Silver Sky, the plane that had ended an age. By 1946, the same airfields that once launched kamikazes now hosted American trainers and humanitarian flights. The same runways that had seen flames now saw supplies: food, medicine, seeds, paper. The empire that had burned its maps now learned to draw new ones, maps not of conquest, but of recovery. In that transformation from fire to silence, from war to reconstruction, the legacy of the Mustang and the men who faced it was sealed. The war had not just ended, it had evolved. Humanity had learned to redraw its borders not on land, but in the sky. History remembers victory as a flag raised or a treaty signed. But the real moment Japan's empire ended was quieter. A night of burning paper when men in uniform watched their own maps curl into smoke. That was the instant when geography surrendered to the sky. The P-51 Mustang had not simply defeated an army. It had rendered the old language of war obsolete. Strategy, front lines, even the concept of distance, all collapsed beneath the reach of air power. The world's first true long-range fighter had shown that dominance was no longer measured in land held, but in sky controlled. For Japan, that realization arrived too late. The officers who fed their maps into the flames understood something no textbook could teach. Power drawn on paper can vanish in an instant when the air itself becomes the battlefield. The lines they had once drawn with pride were illusions. Fragile, temporary, human. When the war was over and the P-51s stood silent on the same runways they once destroyed, the world faced a new truth. Technology had replaced geography. Nations could no longer hide behind oceans or mountains. The sky had become the new frontier of both destruction and connection. And yet in the stillness that followed, something remarkable happened. From the ashes of a shattered empire rose not vengeance, but renewal. Japan's cities rebuilt. Its engineers turned from warcraft to wonder. The country that had been humbled by the sky would, within a generation, master it again. This time with engines made for peace. The maps that burned in 1945 symbolized more than defeat. They marked the moment humanity stepped from one era into another, from the age of empires to the age of air. The Mustang pilots, the Japanese officers, the civilians beneath their paths, all of them were witnesses to that transformation. They had seen the future descend from the clouds, and when the smoke cleared, they learned the oldest lesson of all. Empires built on conquest may fall, but those who learn from their ruins can rise higher than ever before.